All right, we are live. Fantastic. We have an amazing show today. Of course, we have Alexander in London. Alexander, we hope you are feeling better. I think you are feeling better. We are going to pass it
Yes,
off. We're going to pass it off to you. Okay, great. We're going to pass it off to you real soon. We've got an hour of an amazing commentator, analyst, personality with us. We have an hour of his time. The great Mr. Garland Nixon. Garland, it is finally our honor to have you on the show. We've been looking forward to this. I have all of Garland's channels down below in the description box. The best place to plug into him is Rockfin. He has an amazing show on Rockfin, but he's on a ton of platforms. Garland, how are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful. Thanks for inviting me.
Fantastic. So let's get right into it. Alexander, I'm going to pass it off to you. A quick hello to everybody on Rumble, on Odyssey, on Locals, and on YouTube. And a quick hello to our amazing moderators. We've got an hour. Alexander Garland, the floor is yours.
Yes, well, can I just say it's a special pleasure for me to host Garland, for us to host Garland here on the Duran, because Garland has very generously hosted me many times on his radio shows for Sputnik, and I've also had the great pleasure of actually meeting Garland, and we actually met, as I remember, at an Assange event in London. So it's a huge honor. And I've just a few things to say about Garland, which perhaps most people don't know. We've often discussed the various extraordinary affairs in the United States, Russiagate, Spygate, all of those things. I've had to mention many times that I'm not, by background, an investigator. I'm somebody who's actually had to deal with investigations many times. Garland has been an actual professional investigator. He has that training. He has that knowledge. And when he deals with evidence, not just, police and criminal matters, but any kind of evidence, I can always see he comes with that kind of rigor that a trained investigator has. Somebody who knows how to look at things, get them in the right perspective, understand how they relate to each other, form the correct picture, go where the evidence leads. So where does the evidence lead us today, Garland? Does it lead us to World War III? I see this because I've just come back from reading an article on Zero Hedge where President Vučić of Serbia is talking almost in those kind of terms. He says that in the next 2 months, we could be in a crisis, the greatest crisis we have seen since the end of the Second World War. And he also made the point, which I thought was very interesting and actually very astute of him, when he said that this crisis is global. It's not just Ukraine. And of course, he didn't actually, as far as I could see, mention Taiwan, but one could see Taiwan hovering in the background. And that brought back to me what Vučić was saying, and especially after listening to President Biden's speech at the UN yesterday. Something you wrote to me in an email some months ago, which was specifically about Taiwan. And you were saying that this is an exceptionally dangerous administration that we have in Washington. They are pressing all the most provocative buttons almost in every place that they can. They basically stirred up this crisis in Ukraine. They seem to be edging towards doing the same with Taiwan. So, Garland, what do you think? Are we heading in that kind of direction? Where is this going to go? How is it going to end? Are we in that kind of a crisis?
I think I'd like to take a little bit of a positive position here, and that is, I believe that we have three great world powers, of course, right now that have risen: Russia, China, and the United States. And one of them is confronting, shall we say, the other two world powers. So I think now that the governments and leaders of both Russia and China have come to the conclusion, this is purely my own speculation, but I think they've come to the conclusion that the world is transitioning, particularly economically, transitioning. And since the U.S. empire has used its economic power in recent years as its principal tool of coercion, I think they realize that this is going to be very upsetting, concerning, et cetera, to the people who run this empire. I believe, from a positive note, that they have taken the responsibility of transitioning the world into this new order without, I hate to use this word, but I'll use it, provoking the crazies in DC into pushing the nuclear button. So while we've got a Washington, DC neocon group that's clearly unhinged, I think the saving grace is that the Russians and the Chinese understand that they're dealing with unhinged people, and they see it as their responsibility to transition us in there, to manage this transition without totally freaking out these neocons to the point where they push the button. I know they have to protect themselves. So I'll take a positive perspective on that. And I believe that the Russian and the Chinese leaders have the capability working together to do that.
I think people underestimate the extent to which they do work together, even now, actually. I mean, there was these meetings between Putin and Xi Jinping at Samarkand, and we know of two meetings that they had in Samarkand. One was a one-to-one meeting, which is the public one. Then there was another meeting which they had with the president of Mongolia. Lavrov, by the way, has confirmed to us that they had more meetings, which were sort of more informal meetings, but they were clearly talking a lot with each other. Then we also know that their national security advisors, Patrushev and Yang, I get his name wrong, but anyway, let's call him Yang, that they met as well, I believe in Beijing. And there's rumors, by the way, which obviously we're not in a position to confirm, that they were discussing, amongst lots of other topics, joint production of advanced microchips. That this is one of the big topics on the agenda. Now that's true, even if it was on little things like that, then that tells you how extensive this cooperation between those two powers has now become. So I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things that came across from Samarkand was how very far the two governments went to make it clear that coordination between each other was something that they needed to go on enhancing all the time. So they are a team.
Yeah. There's people have been, yes, definitely. And people have been comparing these times to, pre-World War I and pre-World War II and things of that nature. And I think you can find some comparisons that would be accurate. But I think there is a dynamic that's different now that has to be taken into account. For a country to successfully prosecute a war, as we've seen in Russia, as Abraham Lincoln said, a leader can never get too far out in front of the public opinion of the people of their particular country. And what we've seen, the leadership, I think, quite skillfully, the leadership of Russia, what they've been able to do is something even, I think, more impressive, and that is to get what we call in the business world market insistence, to kind of hesitate to do something until it gets to the point where the people in their country actually demand it. And by the time they move, the people in Russia are screaming, "What's wrong with you? Why won't you do X?" And then the Russian government would say, "Well, we really didn't want to do X, but we have no choice now because we've been so pressed by our people." That's why you see these numbers of 70 and 80% support, because they wait until the people scream for it, and then they're simply giving the people what they want. And I think that's brilliant politics. And it's kind of the way I think. So of course I would think it was brilliant. You get ahead of people and you get people to beg you for things. Again, in business, which I have a little bit of a background in, market insistence is the term. You want the people out there begging for your product. That's what they do. Now, here's the dynamic, I think, that's so different from World War I and World War II. And that is, in order to prosecute a war, you have to have support of the people at home. Look what's happening in the US. Look what's happening in Europe. The people there are now, they're at the most basic level of survival: food, shelter, things of that nature. Right. So generally a government will try to frighten you into supporting a war based on what? Security. You have to support this war because the Huns or whoever it is are going to invade. They're going to, kill all the men and enslave the women and children. Right. So let's go to war. And the people say, okay. But the people in the EU, particularly in the EU, but also starting to get that way in the US, are looking around at their basic survival needs that would be provided, shepherded by their leaders. And they're saying to their leaders, we already don't have our basic needs to survival at home. And you're trying to frighten us into saying there's somebody out there that's going to get us. Well, we're not going to live long enough to get out there. So I think the dynamic is the dysfunction within the U.S. And, I use this term, the U.S. empire and its allies or colonies in Europe. So how are they going to continue? Let me put it more basic. The leaders in the West have the dual problem of dealing with this problem that they've created with Russia while trying to manage massive dysfunction and virtual economic collapse at home, which means that time's not on their side. And I think Russia and China know if they can get this thing into the winter, they don't have to go a long time before people are going to start turning their countries inside out. And we're going to start seeing regime change all throughout the West.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that. I mean, I noticed that I was getting reports from Greece, from my brother in Greece, about energy rationing now being introduced into Greece. This directly after huge increases in cost of electricity in Greece. And he was saying, we've been asked to pay far more for getting far less. And apparently the people he was working with, many of them were close to tears about this. This is what he was telling me. So, and one can see this repeating itself right across Europe. But isn't there a danger that as these people in these Western governments, in Washington itself, become increasingly concerned that things are going to start turning against them, that, the war, I actually think we'll come to the war in Ukraine in a moment, but, that as things start to go wrong, that they're going to start looking for increasingly dangerous ways to escalate themselves. And that could take us further along the path that people like Vucic was saying.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And I would say one of those things was the Nancy Pelosi trip. That was a perfect indicator. Well, look right now, we have two bills in Congress. One of the bills would make Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. And Russia has said, if that happens, our diplomatic relations will absolutely collapse. Another of the bills would give like $3 or $4 billion to Taiwan. Ostensibly, we know that goes to like Raytheon and General Dynamics, but ostensibly $3.5 billion to Taiwan for weapons. And China has said, if that happens, our diplomatic relations will collapse. So right now, we are on the board. We have two bills in Congress that were they to go through, were they to get signed by the Biden administration, which I have great. I put it like this. I can't see. One may be signed. I don't think both of them will be signed. But the bottom line is if they were both signed, diplomatic relations would collapse with both. So again, I think this gets back to, remember, it's not what happens to you in life. It's how you respond to what happens to you that determines, your path, right? So again, they can do all the provocations in the world. I think I saw it as a hint when Pelosi went to Taiwan and everyone said, that's it, it's going to be war. And China sat back and said, we're going to make some moves, but we're not going to be baited into this. We know their game. We're not biting the hook. We have more time than they have. They don't have time. So I think, again, the Russian and Chinese leaders, while they will be baited, unless there's an all-out attack on them or some kind of attack on them, I don't think they'll respond militarily. Of course, we can't rule that out. But again, I think the military in NATO, the military in the U.S. understands the jeopardy that they'd be putting themselves in, and the pushback from the military would be great. So again, yes, I have some fear, but again, I think Russia and China understand the provocations, and we're likely discussing mutual responses. Let's not forget, before the 24th of February, a week or two before then, Xi and Putin met. I think this was a similar kind of strategy meeting where they planned for the future. And I don't think those plans include war with the United States. In fact, I would argue, I think those plans include how to avoid war with the United States, despite what they know will be escalating provocations, so they can get through this, continue to build their alliances. You see the long-term things they're doing economically. So maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm being, Pollyanna-ish here, but I do have some level of confidence that they understand this as well as we do, and they're planning how to get around it.
I think you're absolutely right, actually. I don't think you're being Pollyannish at all. I read Russian, Chinese statements all the time. I get the sense that they have a very clear understanding of the kind of people they're up against in Washington. They know both how dangerous they are. They know exactly what they're trying to do and trying to bait them into confrontations. And they're not going to be drawn into those confrontations. And can I just, before we proceed, touch on Putin's comments in that speech he made yesterday about nuclear weapons, because they have been completely misrepresented. It was I've read people say, I read Reuters say that he was threatening to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. He said no such thing. He said if the Western powers were to launch nuclear weapons against us because they sensed that things were not going the way they intended, well, be aware we have them too, and we will respond. But he wasn't talking about using nuclear weapons proactively. And I think this is a point which, as I said, has been completely misrepresented. It continues to be. All the talk about nuclear weapons use up to now has been entirely in the West, not in Russia at all, up to this point. But I don't think the Russians want to go there. I don't think they have any intention of going there. I think this is a warning to the West. Don't go there. If you do, you will get yourself into serious trouble. Now, let's just turn to the situation with the war. I think you're absolutely right. I think by the way, your analysis is about, this mobilization is completely right. I've been, again, following Russian commentaries, not just on their Telegram channels, but on their television, on their newspapers. There's been this rumbling growth. Why are we not, why are we not taking this seriously? Why are we wasting time, with military exercises in the Far East? Why aren't we mobilizing? Why aren't we sending more of our army there? Why aren't we settling this? Now it's happened. We're going to see far bigger forces being deployed by Russia in this conflict in Ukraine. We're going to see actual moves to incorporate these regions into Russia itself, changing the legal basis of the war. Now, I don't see how Ukraine, even with all the Western support it's had, can absorb this latest attack, which is coming. Now, is that something people in Washington understand?
Well,
do they still think that they can pull something off? I don't understand what they're thinking now.
Yeah, I think there's two things going on here. There's the information war, which, let me add this, but when people talk about the information war, you have to talk about who is it directed towards. It's directed towards the people of the West. The information war is to mislead and misinform the people of the West. So there's the part of it that is just simply the information war. But I think that there are people in the Pentagon who clearly understand the reality of the potential war that they're on the edge of. I also think they understand that they don't have the physical forces. Having talked to Scott Ritter a number of times, they don't have the physical forces really for a confrontation in Eastern Europe, a kinetic confrontation with Russia. So they understand how that's going to go. I think they understand a lot more than they let on. because they play the narrative game. And, the narrative game, you're always trying to figure out how much they really mean and how much is, pure unadulterated lies. And with the neocons, 100% is pure unadulterated lies most of the time. But I think they understand more than they think. But I think the important, to me, here's something important, because I keep getting into time. They have a huge problem with all of their plans. I understand. Have you said that? Have you heard that it's going to take 2 to 3 months for this mobilization? Are those the numbers you're hearing? Which is perfect for Russia. If they maintain the pressure, in 2 to 3 months, we're into November. Again, it's kind of like if you're playing a football game, what other kind of football game, and you have a small lead and it's getting close to the end. Your if you're behind, your adversary is not the other team. Your adversary is the clock. Right, you've got to score quickly because the clock's the clock's running, and you got to try all kinds of things. Again, that which argues your point that they could try some dangerous provocations. But I think that now, when we get into November, Europe is going to be in deep and serious trouble, and the future is not going to be. The present is not going to be looking bright, and it'll be much more difficult. The closer we get into winter, the more difficult it gets for the neocons and for the people in their vassals in Europe to stage provocations, to drag their people along. The people are going to be screaming louder and louder. Look, you've got to look internally and fix these problems, and they're not going to be able to do it. And let me add this. The Russians are doing, on the battlefield, they're making a move. It wouldn't surprise me if at some point, accompanying the new move on the battlefield, as a response to one of these provocations, as a response to, some move by the neocons, that they don't say, that's it. We're cutting your fertilizer. We're cutting your gas. We are cutting everything until further notice. And they do it when the West could least possibly absorb that. And so they set themselves. I mean, if I'm running Russia, I say, as I get closer to launching my big offensive, I'm going to put you in great jeopardy and peril at home. I'm going to make the move just before I do that, because I know you're planning on something, but I'm going to throw a burr under your saddle. Just as you plan it, I'm going to hit you with another one, and your people are going to start screaming at you, and you're going to have that. See, the leaders in the West have two enemies. One enemy of choice is Russia, China. The other enemy that they're going to have is uprisings at home. And if I'm Russia, I'm going to fuel those uprisings as I make a move by cutting you off. Not to mention, I'm just kind of angry and mean. So I'm not giving you any of that stuff if you're trying to screw me over. So it's a good thing I'm not the leader, because things would already be bad.
Absolutely. So, can I turn to another topic which is very closely related to these? Because obviously we are going to see more and more economic distress in Europe, certainly, probably in the United States. We're going to see more protests. We're going to see more people coming out and saying there has to be a change of course. But I can't help but think that simultaneously and at the same time, we're going to see the powers that be, especially in Europe, responding to all of this. They're going to say, look, you're a Putin agent. If you're coming out and you're protesting against this, you're somebody who's basically on the side of the enemy. And therefore, we've got to start taking more and more steps against you. We're going to pursue your disinformation. We're going to try and shut you down as a disinformer. We're going to investigate you. We're going to do all sorts of things of that kind. And I have to say, we are seeing a lot of that happen in the United States as well. Is that going to get worse?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree that it will get far worse. Out of desperation, again, what we're going to see with the leaders, and this happens with the collapse of empires, is their biggest fear becomes uprising at home. Their biggest fear becomes revolution at home, because they have to manage the people. Because the bottom line is this: the people, let me just say, of the EU and the people of the US have an illusion that they are in a democracy. They have an illusion that they are independent and sovereign. And the more desperate the US gets, the more it casts the illusion aside. It says we can't, afford the illusion anymore. So we're just going to come right out and say to the leaders of Europe, destroy your economies. And, who cares if the people start to figure out that they're being had, that, you're just a colony now. So I think that we're going to see certainly increased censorship and the government going after dissident opinions and things of that nature. But again, as General Winter gallops with his icy white steed into Europe, and people start facing existential threats, namely food and clothing and warmth and things of that nature. The problem they're going to have, if I say to you, you're a Russian bot and you should be dealt with, okay, people may be afraid they'll lose their job, whatever. But as people start to be concerned for the lives and existence of their families, they're no longer rational. Those are arguments that, evoke some kind of a rational response, some kind of an anger, some kind of a denial. And I think they're pushing people to the point where they will no longer be rational and they won't care. Look, if I'm starving to death, what do I care if you call me a dissident or a Russian bot? I got bigger fish to fry. My family and I have no food and we're about to be thrown out. So the problem that they have is they're pushing people into a corner so far that they're not going to want to talk anymore. We're going to get to a point where people are like surrounding the Capitol building. We've seen this happen in history where people surround the Capitol building. And here's one of the great dangers, and as you know, one of the great dangers of anyone who is in power is, the people all come out. There's 150,000, there's 1 million, however many people, and they come to the Capitol building. They come to the building of power, Congress, whatever it is. And there's the proverbial Praetorian Guard, there's the police or whoever, and they've got their guns pointed at the crowd, and the crowd says, we want X. And the people say, we ain't going to get it. And the crowd says, we're coming in the buildings. And here's the danger. The leaders say to the police, the soldiers, whatever, fire, take them out, stop them. At that point, if the guards of the state drops their guns and says, we ain't shooting our own people, or says, wait a minute, we're on their side, these are our families, it's over for the government. So that's the government, if they push the people to a point, which seems to be coming, where the people, seek redress physically and come to their buildings and say, look, something's got to give. And at that point, they attempt to put that down through state violence or whatever. What happens when the police or whoever, who are also, remember the police, and I was a policeman for years, the policemen can't pay their bills, they can't feed their families, they can't heat their homes, etc. If you push it to the point where they drop their guns and they say we're on their side, it's over. You've lost everything. So that's the danger that the leaders put themselves in if they make an attempt to do, kind of the ultimate put down of state violence. The closer they get to that, the closer they get to the guards, the people that they count on protecting them, siding with the hoi polloi, the great unwashed, the crowds of us out here who don't matter to the ruling elite.
Indeed, and they were already nervous about the loyalty of the National Guard that they deployed in Washington at the start of 2021, which I found astonishing. By the way, on that, just at a quick historical point, I've been to the place, the square in St. Petersburg, where exactly what you said happened in 1917, the place where the Cossacks actually switched sides, which set in train the whole sequence of events which led to the Tsar's abdication a few days later. So, I've actually been at the very physical spot where that happened. So, a number of other things. Do you think the neocons, when they started this whole thing, expected to be in this position? Did they imagine the economic crisis that is now unfolding? Did they believe that if they started to impose these sanctions, that it would backfire on them in the way that it has? Because I'll tell you, it's a loaded question, because I'm sure I know the answer, which is that they didn't. That they didn't in their wildest dreams imagine that it would come to this. But what are your thoughts about this? Were they prepared for this in any way?
Absolutely not. I would recommend people, if you want to understand the neocons and these technocrats, there's a great book, but I love to read. I read all the time because lots of books behind me. And a great book by John Ralston Saul called Voltaire's Bastards. And it describes the neocons, the technocrats, and how they got there. And there's a saying in psychiatry, neurotics build houses in the sky, psychotics live in them. Right. And they do both. They do both. So they create this narrative. They all get together. They get this group think and they say, this is going to happen. We know that's going to happen within a few weeks. Russia's going to fall apart. Why? For God's sake, it's just a gas station with masquerading as a country, et cetera, et cetera. And everything falls apart. And they then simply regroup and say, well, then we'll do this. Because the interesting thing about watching the rule of the neocons is watching governments that have no concern whatsoever for their constituents. They almost seem to show contempt for the working class, contempt for the average person out here that's making a living. You know, they have no, if you look at the way, to me, look at the way these people are treating the Ukrainian soldiers and the Ukrainian people. They're casting their lives aside with total and remarkable disregard. They're throwing the Ukrainian bodies at Russian artillery as though they were, you know, as though they were playing a game. So I see them, and I don't know if this is even metaphorically, it may be realistically, as sociopaths. The thing to think about again, a great book, The Sociopath Next Door, to understand sociopaths. But the sociopath, they go out in the street and they could care less about anybody. They don't care if they run you over. They don't care if they steal your stuff. They could care less because they really have no remorse and no conscience. But when a sociopath comes home, they treat their family the same way because they don't have particular emotional tools. They don't have a conscience. They don't have a fear of consequences, things of that nature. So the way a sociopath treats his enemies is exactly the same way that a sociopath treats their friends, allies, family, etc., because they don't have the emotional tools to view anybody as anything other than something to feed their sociopathic tendencies. That's what we see about the neocons. And there are some inherent weaknesses that are created by that, a number of them, but that's where they are right now. They don't really care about the American people. They don't care about anything like that. I do think it will be interesting to see what happens, the backlash after November. I suspect that the Democrats will get wiped out here, and how that will affect things, I don't know, because I don't know how much you know about the Republican Party, but the leadership in the largest portion of the Republican Party is captured by the same forces that hold the Democrats. But it will be interesting to see if that in any way, shape, or form has an effect. The one thing it will have, one area it will definitely have an effect, and that is if in fact the Republicans have gained power, they will start going after Biden and his team. And that will put them on their back feet a little bit. They'll have to, because now they're going to have, oh, the evil Russians, we got to deal with them. Oh, the American people are unhappy because we're in a recession, we got to deal with them. Oh, no, here the Republicans are coming after us for Hunter Biden or, you know, Russiagate or Fauci or whatever the case may be. So it will be, basically another front will be opened against the Biden administration and the neocons, even though it'll be by other neocons. And I'll add this, and I don't look for the Republicans to do some kind of a great, you know, unveiling of information for the benefit of all. I look for them to do investigations, unfortunately, in a lot of ways, on behalf of the national security state. I don't think they're going to investigate Hunter Biden and Joe Biden that much for Ukraine. They're going to investigate them for China, so that they can then say, there we go, Biden's been doing something with China. China's bad. Well, what about the other things? What about Ukraine? Let's get back to China. So that's what I expect. I have no confidence that the Republicans are going to do anything outside the national security state's wishes.
By the way, I agree with that. And what is fascinating, Garland, is of course because we have people, we've interviewed many people on the Republican side, Robert Barnes. You're on the progressive side, but on this analysis, you converge. I think you both say that, you know, there'll probably be a Republican sweep in Congress, but it will that doesn't mean that the establishment, the leadership of the Republican Party is going to be in any way interested in changing anything fundamental, they will be trying to use it for their own purposes. And I think this is exactly right. But it does suggest that there is going to be a cracking in US politics. Do you think this is true? Do you think this is likely?
Yes. And something that you brought up, and that is the whole business. There's this discussion of, the left, the right, the center, et cetera. And a few comments on that. Number one, the term fascism is always thrown about, right? And traditionally we've heard like ultranationalism is fascism, right? I believe that to a large extent, what we see with the Biden people is an ultra liberalism. That it's another flavor of fascism. You can get in the same way that you use the word democracies, but there are various types of democracies. A democracy in a particular country, as a result of the particular culture of that country and the history of that country, produces its own variants of democracy. And I think it's the same way with fascism. Look at the different types of fascism worldwide. And I think the Biden administration is a form, a flavor of fascism. So I look at oh darn it, I forgot the question. I got so wired up. What was the question again?
Oh, we were talking about I was basically saying that you're because I mean your background, I think it's fair to say, is the old traditional left progressive, which is, by the way, my traditional background. That's where I came from originally. Right. But we are all seeing the perspective in the United States from our different perspectives, from our different origin points. We are seeing it all coming together in the same way around this November election, in the sense that we expect the Republicans to win. We don't necessarily expect a particular big change. We expect the Republicans to use the fact that they've gained control, at least of the House, possibly of the Senate, for their own political purposes. But certainly the Republican leadership does not want to challenge the established order, the deep state, any of those things. But nonetheless, it may provide an opening for other forces. It might open up the envelope of discussion, which has been really kept incredibly closed up to this point. That's basically the question I was making.
Great. I'm glad that pointed me back in the right direction, because one of the things that you mentioned, I wanted to comment on that, and I think is relative to this. And you said, well, Robert Barnes is a conservative and you're a lefty, and you agree in this particular area. I think what we're looking at, because that's a big discussion now, and that is why is it that Garland Nixon and Tom Luongo, who is a diehard libertarian, what's he call himself, an anarchist, all kinds of things like that. But Tom and I are good friends and we agree on so many things. Why, how did that come about? Yeah. I think what we're really looking at is there's the issue of ideology, but I think what we're looking at now is fact-based versus narrative-based politics. That Tom and I and plenty of other conservatives and Jimmy Dore or Glenn Greenwald, we can all look at facts and we can say that's a fact. Now we can take our ideological spin or our ideological view and we can say, therefore, I think we should give everybody health care. And the next person says, no, the government should never do health care. But we can agree on basic facts. And I think that's what we're looking at. That's why, oftentimes I find myself having a more reasonable discussion with some of the so-called far right, with some of the MAGA people, than certainly the blue no matter who Democrats, because we're talking about fact-based politics. We're talking about also people who want a deep understanding of what's going on, as opposed to those who are simply are happy to have a superficial understanding and use talking points. So a discussion between Tom and Garland is going to be based on facts, and then we're going to work with our ideology. But since we both are basing it on facts, it's going to be a reasonable discussion. And where we disagree, there will be a true disagreement rather than simply a character attack or an ad hominem kind of attacks. So I think that's what we're looking at. Narrative-based ad hominem style politics, as opposed to fact-based politics that puts the facts first and the ideology second.
Yeah, I've never known, by the way, ad hominem attacks being used in debate here in Britain to the extent that they are used today. I mean, it is actually incredibly demoralizing and frankly very frightening to watch. It's like almost sort of, mobs are sort of launched against people when they sort of step out of line on any particular issue. And it's really, really, really scary. I wanted to also say, I completely agree with your point about the neocons having no real concern for the people they use. And there was an article which I remember reading in August last year, well before we had this crisis, this war in Ukraine, by a man called Wes Mitchell, who was Assistant Secretary of State, I'm not sure in which administration, for Europe and Eurasian affairs. Anyway, this article suggested that the United States arrange for Russia to suffer a defeat in Ukraine so as to cause Russia to redirect its interests eastwards and end up in confrontation with China. Now, that was, I mean, when I read it, I thought this man must be mad, actually. I mean, this seemed to me a ludicrous thing, but it's remarkably close to what I think, in a sense, has happened. And I was very interested to see that, Global Times, we all read it, it's the Chinese Communist Party's English language mouthpiece. They referenced this article a short time ago. There was an article that they wrote in which they actually mentioned this article in National Interest by Wes Mitchell. And I can't help but think that the Chinese certainly know about what people like him and the neocons are talking about. And I'm sure the Russians do, and that they talk about it with each other. Because one of the other extraordinary things about the neocons is that even though they act in a very secretive way, in fact, it's not difficult to find what they're thinking at any one particular point in time, because they are obsessive and voluminous writers. It's all over the place. I mean, you have all these weird magazines and articles that they write, and you can find their ideas very clearly, and they're exactly as you said. What does the United States need to do to get rid of these people? I mean, do we need to go through a big crisis?
I think that, and it's not just the United States, because, if you look at what's happened, there's a whole systemic problem behind the neocons. And what they've done, the same as in British, the same as in England, the same as in many other countries, is they basically, stocked both parties. So to the point where you have one party, so you can get rid of this president or this prime minister and get a new one and nothing changes. They've set things up. I think what we're going to be looking at is this. The people will wake up when they say, okay, we've had enough. Darn it, we're getting screwed. And we want a new administration. And they get an administration and they get the same thing. That's when they're going to get the pushback. That's when they're going to realize, there seems to be no way out. And I think you're going to start seeing more what the neocons would call extremist people who are like realistic. You're going to see these extremists who actually go by facts and reality and have some concern for the working class. You're going to see those people start to move up. Keep in mind something about the U.S. Senate. The U.S. Senate, there's 50 people, but they've got a lot of these arcane rules and parliamentary rules and things of that nature that make it easy for people to really muck up the process. You don't have to, a new party doesn't have to have 20 or 30 people. Generally, it's right around 50-50 with the two parties. And literally, there's 100 people in the Senate, so it'll be like 51-49, 52-48 or something like that, right? If some other party, some other group gets 3 people in, they can determine which side they want to, which party they want to caucus with, and they can give all the power to one party or another. They can, they can really muck up the process. So the reality is, in the Senate, in the United States, if you get a few senators in who aren't down with the process, who are really willing to push back, that's all it would take, 2 or 3. There could be some massive differences made. Now, that's hoping that they wouldn't, meet an untimely demise at the hands of the national security state. But that being said, I do think there's a horizon ahead, and it's not far off. That what we're looking at with in the same way that other economic and social systems have crashed, I think this neoliberal order is washing ashore. And I'll put it a little bit differently. There's something that we won't name. There's this invisible beast, invisible monster. It manifests itself in economic policy. It expresses itself in economic policy as neoliberalism. It expresses itself in foreign policy and militaristic expansionist policy as neoconservatism. It expresses itself culturally as wokeism. This is all one invisible beast, but those are the three heads that it has, and it pops up as either or all three of those at the same time. I think that beast, that monster, is the one that's starting to wilt. There are a lot of people that are getting tired of the woke stuff that are starting to push back. A lot of lefties are like, we're sick and tired of this. So I think they've pushed it too far, and that's the problem. They're pushing it too far, and I think it's going to come back to rather people think that there's going to be like a slow kind of fall. I think we're looking at dramatic collapse, an immediate collapse, as opposed to a slow wiltering away of this particular economic, military, and cultural monster, beast, whatever you want to call it.
About the latter, I completely agree. By the way, I mean, to come back to what was my original training, I trained as a historian. And I can tell you one thing about empires and power structures. When they collapse suddenly. It's a complete myth that empires collapse slowly. There is usually a tipping point, and then they suddenly and dramatically unravel. That happened to Rome, by the way, contrary to what many people say. In 400 AD, Rome, stretched all the way from the Persian border all the way to Britain. 10 years later, Alaric was in Rome. I mean, the collapse, when it comes, is sudden, it is dramatic, and there is no return. There may be attempts to try and some kind of thing, and the mess from the collapse of empire can be very untidy, but it is very sudden indeed. And I think exactly the same as you. It could be complicated. Will it be liberating? Will it be liberating for the people, not just of Europe, but of the United States, which is the epicenter of this? Will they find freedom, as a real freedom, as a result? Or will it be chaotic and dangerous?
Well, I think it's dangerous simply because there's nuclear weapons involved. So that's a certain level of danger. But as I said, that kind of puts the responsibility on the other world powers to manage it. So I think it will be, what we'll end up seeing is not so much how the U.S. empire and the feckless, absurd leaders, preposterous leaders that we have manage it, but how the other power brokers in the world react to the things that are going on inside the United States. I also think that when empires collapse, it's also as a result of what I kind of call the bunny rule, wherein that you've probably heard the old story before, where someone gives a family goes to the pet shop, and they give the little girl a bunny, and she loves the bunny, and she hugs the bunny so tight all the way, and when she gets home, the bunny's dead. She hugged the bunny to death, right? That an empire does that. They try to hold on to unipolarity so hard that becomes the very thing that ends unipolarity. And I think that's what's going on right now. And it's interesting because what you said was, if you think about it, historically, a sudden collapse was 10 years. Now, in the midst of that collapse, 10 years seems like a hell of a long time if you're sitting there in the middle of it. But in hindsight, 10 years was boom. So I think that's what we're looking at. You can look at it right now and say, 10 months from now, this world's going to be real different. Europe is going to be really different. The leadership is going to be a lot of things are going to be really different. Something else I'd like to add that I think is important. One of the things that I think that's critical that has happened is the world has been reminded that, look, when money and economics started, Some guy had a bag of salt, some guy had a bag of sugar, some guy had a bag of dried fish, salted fish, and they needed to trade. And they traded. But there are other things needed. So now they're going to use shells. They're going to use this or that. But ultimately, somebody's still trading dried fish and rice and sugar, right? The US, the West came up with this monetary, this financialized system where it's magic, it's asset-backed securities and derivatives, and they thought that was real. And when they went after Russia, the world was reminded people need salt, people need sugar, that underneath the foundation of every economic system is rice and dried fish and sugar and things of this nature. And the world was reminded that the people who have that are the ones that we want to talk to, that if I'm on a desert island and I got $1 million in cash, I should burn that to cook this fish that I just was able to get off the shore, because the value of the fish is greater than the money. And I think they have reminded the world that I think is the true death of neoliberalism, that the world has been reminded commodities is where it's at. All this magical crap from Wall Street is just that. It's magic. It doesn't exist, and it's gonna float away.
I completely agree with you. I think both of us completely agree with you. Alex, do you want to, because we got 10 minutes, we got Garland for 10 minutes. Do you want to add a few things, maybe?
Yes, I was watching one of your shows, Garland. I believe it was 3-4 days ago, and I was watching it on Rockfin. Definitely follow Garland on Rockfin, and you gave, I think, one of the best explanations about what awaits Europe with regards to the economic crisis and the energy crisis, and you likened it to crossing a river, and that was your analogy, and you even made the point that even if Europe makes it through this year, you said what awaits them next year. Can you share a bit of that insight for everyone?
Sure, certainly. So what I was saying is this: look, they say, are we going to make it through the winter or not make it through the winter? Right? That sounds great, but what does that mean in reality if they don't make it through the winter? In reality, what it means is millions of people out in the cold starving, millions, tens, hundreds of millions of people literally starving and freezing. It means gas stations with no gas. It means that you're back in the hunter-gatherer age in Europe. That's what not making it through the winter. But the other part I said is this. But the discussion is, okay, we make it through the winter. It's the equivalent of someone's being chased by a killer. And they get down to the river and they look, and they're alligators. So they look behind them. They're like, well, I got to jump in the river because there's a killer behind me. And they start swimming, and they look on the other side of the river, and there's a pride of hungry lions waiting to eat them. So even if you make it across the river, the alligators don't get you. There's lions on the other side. So the question is, if these leaders are saying, make it through the winter, and the question is, well, let's say we do. What's your plan? Because at the end of the winter, we will have exhausted everything we could every trick that you could possibly play to get a little extra energy and a little extra fuel and a little extra. You'll have done everything. And now it's spring. People want jobs, and you've exhausted everything. You have no cards left to play. Now you get out of the winter. Yeah, we're alive, but we are in real serious trouble. And they're like, well, this is going to last for 5 years. This is going to last for 10 winters. Where is your evidence that it's once you've deindustrialized, that's magically at the end of 5 years or 10 years or whatever number you're arbitrarily giving us, that somehow at the end of that time, magic is going to happen and things are going to come back around? No, you have destroyed your economic model that was very successful, and there ain't no way to fix it. So that's basically what I was talking about. Look at short term, medium term, and long term. And really, the spring isn't that far away, but if you are the leaders of Europe, it's going to seem a hell of a long ways away.
So can I just before we quickly add, just make one very quick observation? If you know anything about famines, which I've studied extensively, famines hit in the spring.
Exactly.
People get through the winter. It's the spring when famine historically tends to take place. Carry on, Alex.
No, I was just going to ask. So then, what do you think, in practical terms, happens in Europe come spring, this spring or the next spring? I mean, what's the picture that you're seeing, Garland, as we go along? as we enter
I
winter?
think that's when the situation goes really bad in Europe, if it's going to go really bad, because throughout the winter, it's a little harder to protest. It's freezing, it's ice cold. You're huddled together like puppies. You're trying to, nibble on whatever you can to survive. Now the summer comes and you can get outside and you are not happy. And again, people are hungry and cold. They are not rational and they are not peaceful. So unless the leaders find a way to work things out with Russia and to get their cheap energy model back going, which I don't see in the offing, then come spring is when things are really going to hit the fan. A lot of people think in the winter is when it'll go bad. It may, but it's a lot harder in the winter to get outside, and people are still really going to be thinking about survival. It could, if it gets to the point where it's just as cold inside as it is outside, well, yeah, people will go outside. Other than that, when the weather breaks, oh my gosh, you better hide in your you better hide in your basement, because it's not going to be pretty.
Right. Well said. Regarding
one other
Garland's
thing,
point,
one other quick
yeah.
thing. And like Alex says, so what happens is, traditionally what do human beings do? They, even back in prehistoric times, they get all of this dried fish and all of these things to make it through the winter, right? Because that's when you can't cook or fish. There's ice. Okay. So whatever little dried foods in this, you make it through the winter. But as Alex said, now summer comes and you've used up your reserves for the winter, your food reserves, your energy reserves, your wood that you were heating your house, all of that, prehistoric times. Now you got to set out and make it happen because it's warm, but you've used everything up. And that's when you really need help. And again, that's when, as Alex said, that's when things go bad.
Right. Regarding Garland's point about different parties, there are some in Congress and the Senate who speak up against the deep state and the Ukrainian intervention. Rather than supporting the other side and media, we demonize and ignore them. Or ignore them.
That's a comment from a.
Yeah, it's a
from
comment.
Lots of good comments, by the way.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about? There's a lot of questions in the chat about the recent prisoner swap and everything that's happened there. Do you see this as some sort of rapprochement, as some sort of positive light towards something, or nothing of the such?
A couple of things here on that. Number one, I will guarantee you this: deals were made behind the scenes. And you don't know, probably never will know what the deal is. So, of course, any deal, as Alex knows as a lawyer, it depends on what you get out of it. So if I give up a bunch of Azov guys, people may say, how dare you? But they don't know what I got out of it. If I got enough out of that deal, it's worth it. And having, worked in the legal community, I've seen many times where I've been involved in cases, we've struck a deal, and on the outside, people are like, I don't like that deal. Why'd you let that guy go? Yeah, but you don't know the information he gave us. You don't know what that guy gave us. You'd have let him go too if you got what we got. So that's number one. But there's another thing I think that is important, and that is that all the discussion of, well, yes, if you're captured as a soldier, you'll be beaten, tortured, murdered, terrible things will happen to you. And one of the things traditionally that's smart, I have a brother who was special forces and all, and he said, what do? You capture some of the other people. You give them sodas, you give them food, you let them watch TV, you make them nice and happy, and then you let a few of them escape. So they can go back to the other side that's saying, don't get captured by those guys. They'll torture you. And they go back and they say, did they torture you? Well, I wouldn't call it torture. They were pretty nice, to be quite frank. So that's the other side. You let some people go who were there, and it's more difficult to make the case that, they're coming back. They're not beaten. They're not dead. Their fingers are not cut off. It makes it more difficult to make the argument that you're beating and torturing your prisoners. So I can see why the Russians would make that deal if it worked out in their best interest. There are certainly some avenues that you could look at and say, it may not. We may emotionally say, doggone it, those are Azov Nazis. I don't like that. Could be more to it than meets the eye, and I suspect it is.
Yeah. Can I just say, it's been deeply unpopular with many people in Russia, this prisoner exchange, which is completely unsurprising. But coming back to Garland's point about what has been agreed behind the scenes, the key thing to do always is to look at who the mediators were. Now, with the release of the British mercenaries, it was Saudi Arabia. With this particular exchange, it was Turkey. Now, Putin has had lots of discussions with Erdogan recently. He had a long session with him in Samarkand. Erdogan won't be happy about these referendums in these regions in Ukraine, because from his point of view, this undercuts his position as a mediator. So
Mhm.
you have to keep showing to people like Erdogan, look, you're still valued. We still value you as somebody to work with. And if you want to organize a prisoner exchange and give us Viktor Medvedchuk, we don't really want, because we don't have any real use for him. This is a East Ukrainian politician. Well, go ahead. So, I'm not saying that's the entirety of it. There's an awful lot more going on behind the scenes. But I think that plays a certain role in it. I think that it's partly, again, keeping Turkey on side. That's my own personal view.
And the
Very
Saudis,
unpopular event, and the Saudis.
because the
Very
Saudis have,
unpopular in Russia.
yeah, the
Yeah,
Saudis have supported Russia. They made it clear they're an OPEC plus country, and we're supporting the OPEC plus. They've made it clear that if the U.S. plays around with these oil prices too much, that they're going to, reduce production. So I think they have been a not so clandestine ally of Russia. So I agree with you. Look at who's involved, again, they're playing some, and I hate to use this term, but some 3D chess with their allies. They're going to need Saudi Arabia. They're going to need Turkey. And also Turkey can say to the UK or the US, look, I got your people back. I did you a favor. Back off when it comes to the banks or the Mir card or whatever it is. So everybody there's ways that, like I said, I think that this was probably some very smart people playing cards here, and everybody got something out of it.
absolutely.
Yeah, fantastic commentary. We are at the hour mark. So, Garland, any final thoughts as we close out the show?
Well, I just want to thank you guys and let you know I watch your show and I have for a long time. I watch the Duran, never miss an episode, and I really enjoy it. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate the fact that, as many other people are doing, you guys are not, ideologues, that you bring in people left, right, center, as long as they're into some level of fact-based evaluation and analysis. You guys are good to go with them. And that's the thing now. It's not left, it's not right, it's not anything. It is the fact-based analysis, the fact-based politics versus narrative-based politics. And I certainly appreciate the show. Thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to come on. My favorite show.
It's been a pleasure having you on.
A joy, Garland.
And everyone follow me at Garland Nixon on Twitter and my YouTube and my Rockfin shows. I would certainly appreciate that.
And I will put all those links. They're already in the description box, but I will pin them as a comment as well. We highly recommend that you follow Garland. Thank you very much, Mr. Garland Nixon, Mr. Alexander Mercouris. Thank you to our moderators. Thank you to everyone that watched us on Odyssey, Rumble, Locals at Duran.locals.com, and on YouTube, of course. And we had a lot of questions, and we will get to those questions in a dedicated video as well that we will do. Take care, everybody. Have a great Thursday.